سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح يسعك الفضاء الرحيب الفسيح سبيل الدموع.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulil Kareem amma ba'du. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode of Muslims in non-Muslim lands, a legal study with applications. And those of you who have been following the series will know in the last episode that we had started the introduction to the hermeneutic approaches to religious texts. What we mean by that, just as a reminder, is how do we go about interpreting texts? How do we go about trying to understand what each text is saying? And now when we are speaking about text, we're talking in particularly about the source text. We're not going to talk about within the madhab itself. For example, if we were exploring the text, the mutun within the madhab, what we're talking here about is the source text. So we're looking at quite a higher level. And we introduced three approaches, if you recall, and the three approaches we introduced was the literal approach, which you could call the Zahiri approach if you wish, and we had the liberal approach, because that's, even though sometimes I've used the word modern approach, it basically means the kind of the tradition really, because we've already explained that it's quite clearly a tradition, the tradition which is widely being applied within society. And also what we wanted to talk about with the third one is the traditional approach. So what we're going to hopefully do in today's episode is to discuss these three approaches in more detail. So the literal approach. Now with respect to the literal approach, what are we talking about here? Now, as I say, that it's in the name really, it's what it says on the can, it does what it says on the can, and literal approach is quite that. It is a very Zahiri, a very an absolute application of the text. And you tend to find that this is emanating from, where do we get, or who are the adherents of the literal approach, or who are the applicants of the literal approach? We tend to find that this view emanates from scholars living in Muslim majority states, and particularly of a certain position which we'll come to in a short while. And the way they perceive non-Muslim lands, because they've never had to experience living as a minority, they view and they take the old traditional method, the old traditional dichotomy of Darul Islam and Darul Harb. And so they don't adhere to any of the madhahib. They have no need to resort to application of texts. And when I mean texts here, now I mean text within a madhab, which clearly has fatwa and shuruhat, which is taking into consideration the situation the Muslims find themselves in throughout history. So you're seeing the impact of social customs and the impact of the various communities which the Muslims resided in over the period of the century and the millennia or so since the appearance of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they tend not to follow that particular way of life, and what they do is they are not necessarily affiliated to those four schools. So you've got two things now clearly giving a sort of a conditional position that they will adopt. One is that they tend to be in Muslim majority states, and I'm talking about Muslim majority in terms of power here. And the second situation is they tend not to adhere to the four schools. So you'll see that they'll very much try to apply literally the application and how life was, say, back in the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And because of this position they adopt, they see the rest of the world as Darul Harb. And we see particular adherents. I've mentioned two prominent advocates, Sheikh bin Baz and Sheikh Salih al-Uthaymeen. And these scholars in particular, residing in Saudi Arabia, see that the world in a very different light whatsoever. So, for example, his quote is that it is necessary upon the whole Muslim community to adhere to the book of their Lord and to the authentic sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which I'm sure everybody would agree with. But then when you start to see the language, and this is a particular text that I'm referring to, it's a book, translation of a book called Muslim Minorities, Fatwa regarding Muslims living as minorities. And you can see a clear explanation which is really portraying the same dichotomy which existed in times gone by, and it's a black and white world, it's an us and them. And it makes a very clear distinction of the other. So they rely on a very literal understanding of the source text, and their presentations tend to be very simplistic, very rudimentary, and you can see and you can see that well within the fatwa that you find there. In fact, you can see that there is an element of individuals from within this group can eventually lead towards more of a sort of fanatical or attitude towards religion, and in a way sort of regarding their own interpretation of Islam as being the only the correct one, and nobody else's. And so it can lead to those thoughts. I'm not saying that individuals who adhere to those fatwa which come from those particular scholars or that particular school of understanding. What I am saying is, by taking this kind of zahiri, by taking this kind of apparent meaning understanding, it's leading people to take a more fanatical and a very closed view, not only of non-Muslims but also of Muslims. And so there's no kind of leeway at all, to be honest. There's very little flexibility. It's a case of, look, a Muslim is a Muslim, irrespective of where they are, and they will have to apply those rules and laws wherever they may be. There's no dispensation, there's no taking into consideration context, there's no relevance of residing. Really, if they're struggling to apply Islam in its totality, then they should reside elsewhere. They should leave. They should leave this situation. Why reside as a Muslim minority? They should emigrate to a Muslim majority country. And that's the view. And this is very much what you'll find is individuals from within this group will also be of those who will kind of buy into the sort of right-wing type of attitude within the West, where either, if you can't live in this country according to the way you want to live, then don't live here, leave, go away. So there's no middle road. There's an absolute sort of black and white. So but what if there's somebody applying this literalist ideology or literalist approach? How would they go about residing in a non-Muslim environment? Well, of the three that we've already discussed, whether it's isolation, integration, or assimilation, there's no doubt that they would have to develop a isolationist attitude towards the rest. In a way, they would have to view the non-Muslims with some level of hostility, because they would have to perceive them as an enemy. And doing so, they would then be sort of shutting up shop, so to speak. But this isolation and this disengagement from a non-Muslim society, particularly when living as a minority, is not something which is absolutely sanctioned in the source text, nor do we find it absolutely mentioned in all circumstances within the hadith as well. There are obviously certain circumstances, and that's been mentioned already, both with respect to the Quran and respect to the body of a hadith. And because there's no derivation, there's no deriving masail, there's no looking at, because there's no historical context, there's no history there to be able to delve into, to be able to find examples where Muslims have had to adopt certain circumstantial situations where they were a minority and how they managed to retain their Islamic identity, whereas at the same time be contributing citizens. We see that very much discussed as well. So we find that there's very little opportunity for those individuals who take this literalist approach in their analysis, their hermeneutical analysis of the source text, to develop. They have to sort of stay away. They look at the non-Muslim majority with somewhat resentment and fear, and then there's repercussions to that attitude, because then the majority non-Muslim community, especially since the government is based on those particular principles, starts to look at this community with similar fear. But because the non-Muslim majority are in power, that fear then actually manifests itself with policies which can be, in the case of Muslims, Islamophobic, with attitudes which can be looking at Muslims as a different type of citizen to other citizens, usurping rights that may be given to other communities. So you start to see that this, and eventually persecution. So you can see that this relationship, this mutual relationship of mistrust and resentment and fear is of no benefit to the Muslim community and is no benefit to the majority community. But this is all about how those texts are being read, the hermeneutical approach that's being adopted by those who have the literalist sort of attitude. We also find that, so that's more of a sort of from a religious point of view, from a legal point of view. But we also have more from a political point of view, individuals who also like to adopt the literalist approach. And we have certain individuals who are labeled as Islamists. Islamist, what is an Islamist? It's a very, sometimes a dirty word, which is labeled on somebody that people don't like, and its definitions are very different. But I think I need to define what I'm referring to as an Islamist, in order to make sure that everybody is well aware of what I'm saying. And so what we find is that definition, and let's go for the definition, which is that there's an Islamic political solution to the world's problems, and they call for the re-establishment of the Khilafat, the Caliphate, with one leader residing over the Muslim Ummah, and nothing else is accepted in between. So that's the desire. And these views tend to be supported by, again, graduates of Western education institutes rather than those graduates of traditional schools. Now, I will say, obviously, there is Islam itself in the traditional, looking through the traditional approach, without any shadow of doubt, also supports the concept of the Caliphate, particularly modeling it on that which was applied by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the first four the Khulafa Rashideen. There's no doubt about that. But what we've seen, though, in the absence of the Khilafat, is the traditional scholars have remained away from the political sphere. Whereas the Islamists, and this is the distinction that I can draw here, is the Islamists are well involved with the process. So that's the difference of the two. And if we see historically that these scholars, in terms of their relationship, and we will get to some discussion upon that as I sort of brisk forward, where Muslims have lived, or scholars have lived, not within the sort of, not being necessarily accepted within the political elite, and they've remained away from there. Whether it's Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, they've not got involved directly, bar one or two situations where they became a qadi. But generally speaking, one or two of them became a qadi. Generally speaking, they've remained away from there. And what happened was, if we look at the time of the first four Khulafa and the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we saw really that the legal aspect, piety, scholarship, theology, all resided within one or a very small group of people. So you had the Amir and also those individuals around him. So he resided in a very small number of people, and in all cases it was within the Imam. What we saw after that is the slowly splitting away of the civil structure away from the legal, if I can use that word, or the religious aspect of it. It is for this reason that traditional schools started to come about. Is this split away from civic responsibilities, which in a way became a secular role, even though the Khalif is quite clearly not, but it became a more of a secular role. And we saw the traditional schools separating, and these traditional schools became responsible for maintaining the law, the legal aspect, the religious aspect, but they became leaders in their own right. And many a time they crossed paths, where the religious elite had to speak against the political elite. And the political elite, obviously, clearly, in order to control the masses, wanted as many of the religious elite on their books, so to speak, as possible in order to justify their leadership. But we're sort of going somewhat into more detail than I wanted to, sort of with respect to this hermeneutic approach. So let's return back to our hermeneutics. So what we see here is that this sort of push towards it, and we've got another point as well, which is mentioned in another text, which is called the fiqh of minorities, the new fiqh to subvert Islam. And what they turn to in particular is this discussion of this new sort of fiqh, if I can use a word, or relatively new, which is fiqh al-aqalliyat. And fiqh al-aqalliyat, for instance, is referring to Muslim minority fiqh. Now, the name itself is new, but the process is no different. However, with this new name, there's a new approach, and this new approach is talking about kind of really revamping and changing Islam in terms of how it's practically applied when Muslims are a minority. And the author of this book, comes from the camp, the sort of Islamist camp, his view is quite clearly, and this is a quotation from there, that this has led to the neglect of certain Sharia rules, to the contradiction of what has been established with certainty from the Quran and the Sunnah. He refutes fiqh al-aqalliyat, the author, and he urges to go back to legal texts and study them in order to acquire the Islamic ruling. But what we also find is within the text, and his argumentation is that there should be no political participation in non-Muslim countries. So again, the Islamists is a very political agenda, a very political group, which hasn't been where the religious elite or the religious have ever wandered into. There has been times we've seen that historically in some places, but generally speaking, this was an area which they avoided and maintained their work within their own circles and safeguarded the religious practices or the religious identity of the Muslims. So he concludes his remarks, and we can clearly see his expression. This is again in the book, The Fiqh of Minorities, A New Fiqh to Subvert Islam. He says, the fiqh of minorities is a symptom of a corrupted thought process which looks to the dominant West for its solutions. The aim of participating in the political life of the West is to achieve a set of benefits. However, contrary to what is said by them, these aims can be achieved by following the Sharia path permitted by Islam without the need to commit haram or trying to legitimize it by the deviant use of the rules of necessity, benefit, and repelling the evils. So that kind of really seals it in a way. And that brings me to the end of the literalist approach, the Zahiri approach. Very little give, black and white. This is how it's going to be, and this is how it should be applied, irrelevant of circumstances. We don't take any other practices into consideration. Nothing needs to be really looked at. This is what it's going to be, and this is how it's going to be applied. And if it can't be applied, then one should sort of separate and isolate. We then move on to the liberal attitude, because this is the next step that I want to mention. And liberal is, as we've just sort of finished off on the literalist, is very much pushing this new fiqh, which is called fiqh al-aqalliyat. So, what we see here, for instance, within the liberal approach is very much based on this modern understanding now. So it's a certain way now, it's a secular approach really. And what he's saying, and it's looking at deriving principles and rulings based on that framework, a more secular liberalist approach. So what we start to see is more dilution of existing Islamic practices, which don't sit well with modern practices. You know, this is where we are now. This practice seems a bit out of date. But how do we kind of remove this from our history? How do we remove, or how do we place it in our history? How do we remove it from our current thinking within Islam? What do we do? How do we approach it? So that's really the argument that's given. And there's a number of individuals and organizations who put this, they label themselves as progressive Muslims, and they're looking to challenge the traditional concepts of justice, gender and pluralism based on a more modern liberalism. And what they ask for is, look, this can be carried out in this way. But we're not going to focus too much on those who actually use and claim that Islam is way out of date, and what it needs now is an absolute rewrite. We're not referring to them. We're going to stick to those individuals who argue that for the purpose of faith and first principles, we're going to reason rather from faith and first principles, but doing so in ways that draw upon modernist ideas within an Islamic methodology, ijtihad. So the argument here is that we're not going to bring an alien methodology into Islam and try to get Islam to fit in with that. I'm not going to discuss that, because that is obviously, you can't even call that Islam after that. What I am going to discuss is those individuals who say, look, we still see Islam's general framework, we accept the general framework of Islam, but we feel that it's been stagnant for too long and it requires a fresh ijtihad in order to sort of bring it up with the times it's in now, rather than still be sort of way back in the 15th century or 16th century. That's the kind of argument. So our focus from now on is going to be referring to those individuals, rather than the other individuals who are saying we absolutely need to literally put aside what Islam is, start with a blank sheet of paper and work our way through that. So fiqh is the argument that's being looked at. No point looking at theology. No point looking at ritual acts of worship, because both of those arguably are private and they don't affect anybody, and it doesn't really matter where you live. So it's really pushing onto the muamalat, what's that kind of area. So, and this is where the concept of fiqh al-aqalliyat has come from. And this was a field which was two key individuals. One is Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and the other one is Tahir Jabir al-Alawani. And it's arguably Tahir Jabir al-Alawani who came up with the term of fiqh al-aqalliyat. And we have their respective organizations, which is ECFR, the European Council for Fatwa and Research, and the IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought. And we've seen also lately within the UK, Association of Muslim Social Scientists, AMSS, who have also started some work in this area. So initially when this phrase fiqh al-aqalliyat was sort of bandied around, people just thought, well, you know, yeah, we can see that context plays a part within traditional Islam. Hopefully I've already explained that in some of the earlier lectures and videos. So we've already seen that you know, it does play an impact, there's no doubt about that. And therefore fiqh al-aqalliyat, maybe it's just taking into consideration the context of being a minority. So okay, that's fine. So basically there was, and this was something called an-nawazil. An-nawazil is an area in which due to new circumstances, due to circumstances which weren't there at the time when the original relied upon texts of the madhab were written, they didn't exist. And what's happening now is that because of these new situations, people, Muslims, needed rulings for these new situations. So they were referred to as nawazil. Something happened, we need to respond. Something new is going on, we need to respond to that. So that was the argument. And so people thought fiqh al-aqalliyat was just another name for an-nawazil. But once the specifics started to come out, first of all, people were a little bit confused, and then it went to outright objection and to a certain extent ridicule. There's two particular texts on the subject. في فقه الأقليات المسلمة حياة المسلمين وسط المجتمعات الأخرى, which is one text by Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and another one by Towards a Fiqh for Minorities, Some Basic Reflections by Tahir al-Alawani. These are the two main texts which I've used within my text when analysing the concept of fiqh al-aqalliyat. I've used a number of the papers as well, but these were the two main ones. So the basic argument that's posed within the text is that the global situation has changed over time. Muslims and non-Muslims are living literally next door to each other, working together, socializing together, especially those who are living as a minority. And we found that when you look at the classical Islamic law, the classical Islamic fiqh, we find it's inadequate. There's nothing really there to assist us in this. And so what we need to do, and especially when they look at the ahadith, they say, look, we're really struggling to use the ahadith in their literal sense and even understand, because the situation has changed. And as the situation has changed, they're somewhat more historical now. So the focus, you see, is moving away from ahadith and saying that they're very much historical now, is moving towards the Quran itself in terms of interpreting the Quran. And that's the aim. And that's what it should be referred to due to its eternal nature. And the conclusion is that the minority status of Muslims has created this vacuum, and therefore a new fiqh is required. So that's the argument. Again, what you find within this group are also the group of those individuals who don't adhere to any of the four madhahib. They are very much so those who adhere solely to practices of directly following source texts, which is not the majority of people. Alawani has gone too far to say that it's an unscientific and illogical approach has been applied in the deduction of fiqh, and insists that what we need to do is develop a more open, a more reflective, and a more analytical method. I will argue, whether that's agreeable within the traditional school or not as we progress. So fiqh al-aqalliyat has three fundamental premises based on three fundamental issues. One is the immutability of the Quran, and that's regarded as the overriding source of all legislation, the absolute criterion and final reference. The second is the territorial principle of al-aqalliyat al-Islam, that Islam is a global religion, and the juristic principle of maqasid al-Sharia. So these are the three main areas. By saying the Quran, no one's going to disagree that the Quran is immutable, there's no doubt. By saying that, it's removing the ahadith as a source. Obviously, if hadith is gone, then ijma will follow quite quickly, and qiyas is obviously, which is based on that's gone. So basically left with the Quran. We then have the principle that Islam is a global religion, which means it can be applied and practiced anywhere and everywhere. Thirdly, maqasid al-sharia, which was a derivation of the fiqh, has now actually become the source of the fiqh. So we've got general principles which on the face of it sound okay, but for instance, the Quran itself, the Quran is very difficult to understand and apply. In fact, some would argue near impossible to apply without the ahadith. And then even when the ahadith are silent on certain matters, without ijma, or when matters where there's contradictory or on the apparent contradictory statements, it's very difficult to apply. And also, obviously, when we see that's one area. So the Quran itself is open to interpretations. It's difficult to interpret. So we've got an issue there. The second point, obviously, is that yes, it is a global religion. No one's disputing that point. And the third is the maqasid al-sharia. Is why is it that what was actually a fara, something which was derived from the main body and the full body of the text. So basically, in a way, what we're saying is all the body of the text on certain topics, certain subjects, what we derived from there was the maqasid, and then that derivation has now actually replaced the original when can't replace it because that's the source of it. So these are flawed understandings, but as I said, we'll go along. So we have these problems. And when you've got this Quran is open to it, and this is the hermeneutic approach that we're talking about. When we say that hermeneutically the Quran is now open to interpretation, well, hold on a second here. If you've now removed hadith, and if you've now removed ijma, and if you've now removed qiyas, and I've said clearly that the Quran is difficult to understand without some interpretive method, some hermeneutical approach, what are we now going to replace it with? Well, this is called the liberal approach. So we replace it with liberal values, modern liberal values, and that becomes our interpretive model. And that's the danger. And you can see from the language that some of them use, for example, some scholars who adhere to this, is that we want to liberate themselves, or rather they say they want to liberate themselves from traditionalism by deepening the commitment to the universal values of Islam, whatever they are. And one thing which is a real bugbear for those individuals who follow this particular hermeneutical approach is the traditional concept of taqleed is seen as a problem. Why? This says this is the cause of Muslims not facing today's challenges by hiding their heads in the past due to an excessive paranoia of deviation or Western influence on Islam and Muslims. And to a lesser extent because of literalist reductionism. So they're actually blaming the traditional approach for literal reductionism when we can see that that's further down the actual spectrum. And we go further, the methodology which it refers to is deriving principles from the Quran, reject ahadith, even the mutawatir and mashhur ones. It prioritizes the religious scholars' interpretation, so you're getting a subjectivism coming in. And basically its aim is to adapt the law so to allow legal leniencies as far as possible in order to allow Muslims to live successfully within non-Muslim societies. So we're seeing this kind of discussion. Now when we move on to the maqasid al-sharia, which was the third premise that I mentioned to you, there's also a contradiction here. We see, as was referred to as the father of maqasid al-sharia, who makes this is his statement, he makes rational derivations subservient to the source text when they are mutually supportive. So think about it. He makes rational derivations subservient to the source text when they are mutually supportive, and even more so when the former contradicts the latter. In his muwafaqat, he states, and I'll quote that, if textual and rational evidence are mutually supportive concerning legal questions, then the text is given priority, as it is to be followed, and the rational evidence is deferred, as it is the follower. Reason is not restrained except in the manner the textual evidence itself restrains it. So what he's saying is, if there's an explicit text regarding a matter, and a rational derivation which contradicts it, then the text is given priority. So that really puts aside that maqasid al-sharia should now take a lead and lead on matters when rather it's clearly being mentioned by the father of Maqasid, even though there were scholars before him, Imam Shatibi, saying this particular point. When we look at the other area of fiqh al-aqalliyat, the second premise which is argued, which is the al-aqalliyat al-Islam, that Islam is a global religion, and this permits obviously the rationale for Muslims living as a minority, and this fiqh al-aqalliyat helps to manage the conflict which may exist between liberal democracies and Muslims who want to practice Islam. This is what we're referring to. But we're seeing throughout this Maqasid, I did mention to you that there were a number of other scholars who developed it between the 11th and the 14th centuries. We've seen Al-Juwayni, Al-Ghazali, Abdul Salam, Shihabuddin Al-Qarafi, and Shamsuddin ibn Qayyim. And obviously then we had Shatibi himself. So you're seeing lots of work is going on in this area now by the IIT, and they're looking at making various texts in order to push this agenda. So what they want to really do is look at the objective behind the Sharia rather than look at the fiqh which is already exists, because they see that as literal reductionism, and they want to avoid this concept of literal reductionism and say we need to go beyond that now. Our understanding of law has developed that we need to now start looking at the underlying principles which exist and take it from that point of view. I can say a little bit more about it, but I'm sure as we progress I will be able to discuss this even further. But I want to mention one or two points here about how it is very different. For example, compared to normal traditional law, Qaradawi holds a view which is that Muslim minorities are in a state of tadrij. Tadrij means sort of transient state or transience, meaning that Muslims aren't expected to abide by all the laws immediately. They should be allowed time, like what we saw within the Meccan period, so it should be more gradual rather than in an abrupt and immediate manner, which is completely against the traditional understanding that Muslims, as I already mentioned in other videos, and we will, as we go through this series, will mention it to you as well. Fiqh al-aqalliyat has been criticized because of two main issues. One is those who categorically reject the concept that Muslims who choose to live as a minority should have a special system of fiqh for them alone. So it ends up that Islam is divided up and you have various territorial Islams in the plural. And secondly, and this is even more serious, is the interpretation of fiqh is a bid'ah, meaning it's an illegal innovation, and it is a manipulation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's religion, which can act like a Trojan horse into the heart of Islam and result in the infiltration of religion and bring about a so-called enlightenment and restructure the whole of Islam. Because first, if this starts to come in within a minority situation, what you then see is, because of the fact of liberalism taking place throughout the world, is then this is Islam's response to modernism, and you then have this new religion which is no longer a reflection of Islam. Now, in terms of the traditional approach, we've seen how some people are perceiving traditional Islam now to be irrelevant. It does not answer, and this is growing sadly by the weeks and the months and the years. It does not answer certain questions as they argue, but this is it's a perception, because nowadays many people who do want to look for answers, they want immediate answers. Nobody wants to study for years and years and years at the feet of traditionally trained scholars anymore. They want immediate responses, and as a result, people would like to sort of go to the sources. They can now get English translations of the Quran, they can get English translations of the Hadith, even now English translations of books of fiqh, and just go to them and decide what the matter is themselves. And obviously this causes problems. It's not that the Islam itself is no longer applicable or could be put into practice through the hermeneutical approach that traditional scholars adopt. It's more a case because now those answers aren't what people want to hear. So we've seen, for example, that most aspects of fiqh have been extensively explored and have reached a conclusive end and are not era, context or people related. For example, ibadat, number of prayers in the day, whatever. But something which is different, like muamalat, social affairs, then what we've seen over the last 60, 70, 80 years has never been seen in the history of Muslims, ever, which is now adopting minority situations in predominantly non-Muslim lands. And as a result, there is some area of fresh research. There's some area which requires some work to be done. So what we're going to look at in the following chapters now is to look at the traditional hermeneutic approach in more detail. And what we'll see is there's a number of texts that we'll put there, and we will explore the concept of diyar or dar al-harb and dar al-islam and things of that nature. So we will look into that as well. So we're going to look at now and put our time into, or spending some time rather, looking at the traditional law. And we'll start with the legal approach first, and then maybe go into the principles of it as well. So as we sort of draw the episode to the end, what we want to say is sort of a few things. So before we move on, I want to just draw our understanding together. We've seen, for example, that Islamic scholars or Islamic religious sources, there are three general hermeneutic models that are being applied: liberalism, literalism, and traditionalism. They all claim to interpret Allah's word and to explain what He intends by them. Literalists claim that there's no interpretation required at all. In fact, they go as further to say it's not even permissible. And whereas the liberal approach is that we need to look at a more modern way to take into consideration current social demands and principles. We found the traditional to adopt the middle path, and it argued for a rational system which was not subject to change, but which had an inherent flexibility to allow it to be relevant to all times and all people. In fact, the argument was, in its case, this robustness can be verified by the fact that it has existed for 1400 years and is still going strong to this day. So there is agreement that the three views is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the source of law. The difference lies in their epistemology. So they are ontologically on the same page. The epistemology differs. Some say scriptural in its pure and absolute form for the literalists. Some say society focused, which is in the case of liberals, and some have a combination between the two. Our position, that we will argue, or more accurately sources, is considered to be a tradition, and we look at it as a discursive tradition. And we must apply these historically tried and tested principles and methodologies in order to ascertain Allah's will. To say that the liberal rationalism is required as an interpreted model instead of traditionalism because the latter doesn't suit modern world is flawed. And we're going to look at it flawed in three ways. Why is it flawed? Well, first of all, liberal rationalism itself is a tradition. It cannot claim neutrality and it cannot be given exceptional status, but it must be regarded as a tradition amongst traditions. Secondly, traditions are incommensurable, which means that the premises of views of one tradition, which in this case is liberalism, cannot be applied to religious traditionalism, and neither can it claim to be unbiased, as we've already discussed, and exclusive to truthfulness. And this incommensurability does not permit modernist scholars the legal or philosophical position of assuming and declaring an epistemological crisis within traditionalism, as they are not traditionally trained and only know the model superficially. So we have shown, and we will hope to show, that traditionalism has been applied throughout the history of Islam up to and including the present day by diverse ethnic groups in wide-ranging geographical and political social situations. And however, Muslims have tended to live in majority states, but what we have seen with this migration, that Muslims are adopting minority situations. So using our hermeneutical model, using our approach, because we know it to be flexible enough, we know it can take that into consideration, what we hope to do is once we explore the traditional Hanafi legal model in more detail, we will then try to see whether we can apply that in certain cases. I hope you can carry on following us and enjoying the series. As the next episode, we turn to the first part of the traditional Hanafi legal approach. I hope you can tune in again. جزاكم الله خير ورحمة الله الجزاء. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
فسيح سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح